It was a brisk morning in Maplewood, Massachusetts. Not quite cold enough for snow, but the type of chill that made your breath puff out in clouds and your fingers ache. People hurried in and out of the Maplewood Children's Hospital, wrapped in thick scarves and clutching steaming cups of hot chocolate, moving quickly as if they could outpace the troubles that had brought them there. But one figure stood still. He sat on a crumpled cardboard box near the entrance, sketching intently in a battered notebook. His name was Leo Lee Thompson, just 9 years old. His jacket hung loosely on his small frame, sleeves rolled up, and one of his boots was secured with bright orange duct tape across the toe. A blue beanie sat low on his brow, barely covering his ears. He didn't ask for change, didn't plead for help. He simply observed the flow of people coming and going, an unwavering presence amidst the chaos. Most assumed he had a parent inside, perhaps a sibling. Or maybe he was just waiting for a ride. Nobody dared to inquire too deeply. Not in a place like this. Across the street, parked near a lamppost, a sleek black sedan idled. The engine hummed, but the driver remained motionless. Inside was Michael Hastings, a man in his late 40s with a chiseled jaw and salt and pepper hair. His tie hung loose, and his shirt collar was crumpled. The wealth was evident in the way his car glimmered even under the hospital's harsh lights. Yet he appeared like a man running on empty. In the back seat, a booster seat held his daughter, Clara, just 6 years old, with curly blonde hair tucked behind one ear, her legs wrapped in a soft, pink blanket. Her eyes were wide, but she remained silent. An unfortunate accident had turned their world upside down. One moment she was chasing butterflies in the park. The next, she was confined to a wheelchair, unable to feel her legs. As Michael sat in silence, he opened the back door, lifted Clara with great care, and carried her toward the entrance. He didn't notice Lee at first, most people didn't, but Lee noticed him. He observed the way Michael held Clara, as if she might dissolve into dust, and how her gaze was fixed on the ground, avoiding the looming hospital. Lee's eyes lingered longer than usual. Just before they passed, he stood up and called out, "Excuse me, sir. I can help your daughter walk again." Michael halted mid-step, not out of offense or confusion, but because of the conviction in Lee's voice. Not a sales pitch, not a joke, just earnest and clear, as if Lee truly believed it. Michael turned, brows furrowed. "What did you just say?" Lee didn't waver. He took a step forward, tucking his notebook under his arm. "I said, I can help her walk again." Michael tightened his grip around Clara, disbelief written all over his face. "That's not funny, kid. I'm not joking." Lee's voice remained steady. There was no grin, just a calmness that belied his young age. Michael glanced at Lee's oversized clothes, the taped-up boot, the cracked lenses of the glasses hanging from his shirt collar. This had to be some strange coincidence, maybe even a prank. He turned and walked inside without another word, but the boy's words echoed in his mind. The way they were spoken, devoid of hope or doubt, simply stated as fact. Something about that voice lingered within Michael, gnawing at him until he returned. Michael tried to dismiss the boy in the hours that followed. He sat through Clara's appointments, nodding as therapists and doctors delivered their usual updates. Phrases like, "managing expectations," "long journey ahead," and "miracles take time," flowed through his mind. Yet, Lee's words kept circling like a persistent itch. "I can help your daughter walk again." By early afternoon, as Michael and Clara emerged from the building, the sun had broken through the clouds, but the air remained sharp. He moved toward the car, cradling Clara as he always did, when he spotted Lee once more. Still there, same box, same notebook. This time he was looking directly at Michael as if he knew he would return. Michael hesitated. He glanced at Clara, her head resting against his shoulder, eyes closed, her body lighter than it should be for a girl her age. He turned back to Lee. "It's you again," he muttered, approaching. "Why would you say something like that? Do you think this is a joke?" Lee shook his head slowly. "No, sir. You don't even know her," Michael snapped, gently lowering Clara into the back seat. "You have no idea what she's been through. You don't know what we've been through." Lee stood firm. "I don't have to know her to help. Michael straightened. You're what, 9? Almost 10. Exactly. You're just a kid sitting outside a hospital with taped up shoes. What could you possibly know about helping someone like my daughter? Lee looked down, tracing the edge of his notebook with his fingers. My mom used to help people walk again, he said quietly. She was a physical therapist. He taught me a lot. She said the body remembers things, even when it forgets for a while. Michael stared at him, skepticism hardening in his chest. So what? You watched her do some stretches, and now you think you're a doctor? I watched her help a woman walk after being in a wheelchair for 5 years. Lee replied, his eyes lifting. She didn't have machines or nurses, just her hands, her patience and faith. Michael opened his mouth to respond but faltered. He glanced around. A nurse passed by, offering Lee a friendly wave. A janitor nodded at the boy in acknowledgement. They all seemed to know him. I'm not giving you money, Michael stated firmly. I didn't ask for money. Then what do you want? Lee took a deep breath and stepped forward. Just 1 hour. Let me show you. Michael looked back at Clara, who had opened her eyes and was quietly observing both of them. He sighed, rubbing his temple. I should walk away right now. Lee didn't budge. I should call security, Michael added. Still, the boy remained silent. Finally, Michael huffed. Fine, if you want to waste your time. Kid, meet us at Maplewood Park tomorrow at noon. Don't be late. Lee nodded once. I'll be there. Michael climbed into the sedan, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. But in the rearview mirror, he saw Lee still standing there, hands by his sides, expression unreadable. Later that evening, back at home, Michael sat in his study. Papers littered his desk, none of them making sense as his mind wandered. He kept thinking about how Lee had stood there, like he held a secret. Clara peeked her head into the room. Daddy, she asked. He turned. Yeah, sweetheart. Who was that boy? Michael paused. Just someone we met outside the hospital. She seemed satisfied with that. And what did he say? That he could help me walk. He stared at her, a mix of emotions swirling inside. Clara smiled softly and traced her fingers along the armrest of her wheelchair, as if she were finding her legs again. But Michael wasn't smiling. For the first time in a long time, something inside him felt alive again, dangerous and pulsing with hope. The next day at Maplewood Park was the kind of place most people overlooked. A cracked basketball court, squeaky swings, and a patch of grass that tried to be a soccer field. Sundays were usually quiet, especially around noon. But today, Lee was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. He wore the same oversized jacket, but his notebook was tucked away. Instead, he had a small gym bag at his feet and a folded towel on the bench beside him. At 12:07, Michael's sedan pulled up. He didn't say a word at first, just carefully lifted Clara and set her in her wheelchair, wheeling her over to Lee. He avoided eye contact, arms crossed tightly, as though he feared second-guessing his decision. Lee stood when they arrived. Hi again, he greeted politely. Michael nodded stiffly. Clara waved shyly. Lee smiled at her. Clara. Her eyes brightened. Hi. Michael raised an eyebrow. How do you know her name? You told me yesterday, Lee replied. I remember things. Michael remained silent, gesturing at the towel. So what now? A magic trick? Lee ignored the jab. No, sir. Just the basics. He opened his bag and pulled out a pair of socks, a tennis ball, small jar of lotion, and a plastic container filled with warm rice wrapped in cloth. Michael squinted. What's all that? My mom used, Lee answered. The rice helps with warmth. It loosens tight muscles. The ball helps with pressure points. Michael crossed his arms again. Lee turned to Clara. If it's okay, can I work with your legs for a little while? Nothing will hurt, I promise. And if anything feels weird, just say stop. Okay? Clara looked up at her dad. He sighed. You can try. Just be careful. Lee knelt beside her chair, gently unwrapping the blanket from her legs and placing the warm rice pack over her thighs. Clara flinched slightly. Too hot? He asked. She shook her head. It feels nice. Lee nodded and waited. After a few moments, he began to move her legs gently. Not yanking, not forcing. Just small rotations side to side, up and down. Michael watched closely, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. But everything seemed fine. Have you done this before? He asked suspiciously. Lee didn't look up. My mom used to take me to community centers after school. She helped families who couldn't afford therapy. He continued. Everyone deserves to feel human again. I used to carry her bag. Michael raised an eyebrow. And she taught you this? Yeah, Lee said. She said the body doesn't always need fancy. It needs attention. He tapped lightly on Clara's knee. Do you feel that? No, she whispered. Lee nodded again, unfazed. That's okay. I'll keep asking. He continued to engage Clara while working, asking about her favorite colors, foods, and shows. At first, her responses were short, but soon she began to ask him questions in return. Do you live nearby? Kind of. Do you go to school? I used to. Why not anymore? Lee hesitated. My mom got sick, then she passed. I've been trying to figure things out since. Clara looked down. I'm sorry. Lee gave her a soft smile. Thanks. Michael's posture softened slightly, but he remained silent. After about 30 minutes, Lee gently tapped Clara's ankle again. Do you feel that? Clara blinked a little, sensing pressure. Lee looked up at Michael. That's good. Michael narrowed his eyes. She sometimes says that during her regular sessions. Yeah, Lee replied. But those sessions are inside a room full of machines. Sometimes kids get scared of machines. They tighten up. But here, he gestured to the open park. There's air, trees. It feels different. Michael remained silent, but he was listening now. Lee helped Clara stretch both legs, then gave her simple movements to try with her toes just wiggling. She attempted it. Nothing overtly happened, but she didn't seem discouraged. I'll show you again next week, Lee said, standing. It takes time, but your muscles, he pointed to her thighs, still remember how to be used. You just have to remind them. Clara beamed this time. Okay. Michael cleared his throat. We're not promising anything, he said quickly. Lee nodded. I'm not either. I'm just trying. Michael stared at him for a moment. Then, without warning, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded bill and held it out. Lee stepped back. No, sir. I don't want your money. Michael looked surprised. Then why are you doing this? Lee shrugged. Because your daughter smiled. Michael glanced down at Clara. She was still grinning, but he couldn't understand how a boy who had lost so much could give so freely to a girl he barely knew. The following Sunday, the weather was warmer, but Lee still wore his jacket. Not because he needed it, but because it felt like a reminder of his mother. She used to call it his helper's coat, saying every good healer needed something that reminded them of why they cared. He arrived at Maplewood Park by 11:45. A towel spread out, supplies arranged, and a bottle of water beside him. Nearby, a few kids played basketball, and a dog barked in the distance. At exactly noon, Michael's sedan rolled up, and Clara was smiling before the car even came to a stop. Lee waved at her. Clara. Hi, she chirped, her curls bouncing as Michael helped her into the wheelchair. Michael appeared drained but different this time, less burdened. He gave Lee a small nod. No words exchanged, but it meant more than last week. Lee got to work. Same setup, same warm rice pack. But today felt distinct. Clara was trying now. Can you press your heel into the ground? Lee gently encouraged. She concentrated, closed her eyes. Nothing happened. It's okay, he reassured. Sometimes it takes your brain a while to find the right path. It's like walking through a crowd. You just have to push through. Michael stood behind, arms crossed again. But this time it was more to keep warm than to shield himself. Why do you do all this? He inquired suddenly. Lee glanced up. Because I remember what it felt like when my mom helped people. She made them feel like they mattered. I want to do that too. Michael nodded slowly. You ever think about doing something else? Sometimes, Lee admitted. But this feels right. Michael looked at Clara. She was tapping her toes, barely, but they were moving for the first time. He didn't speak, he just watched. The next few weekends they kept coming, same time, same place. Lee taught Clara how to use rubber bands to strengthen her ankles. He rolled tennis balls under her feet to help her brain recognize where they were. He showed Michael how to massage pressure points behind her knees and explained how each nerve had a role, even when it grew quiet. Then came the day that tested them all. It was the fourth Sunday. Lee showed up like always, but when the sedan pulled up, Clara wasn't smiling. Her eyes were red. Michael looked upset. "She doesn't want to do it today," he said sharply as he lifted her into the chair. Clara refused to look at either of them. Lee approached cautiously. "What happened?" "I tried to move my legs this morning, and nothing happened. Nothing. I'm so tired of trying. It's pointless." Michael turned away, jaw clenched. "She's been frustrated all weekend." Lee nodded. He knelt beside her again. "You think I never get tired?" Clara didn't respond. "You think I didn't sit in a shelter and cry when my mom couldn't afford medicine, and I had to just sit there and watch her?" Her eyes flickered toward him. "You're allowed to be mad. I'm mad sometimes too, but if you stop now, the part of you that wants to walk might stop trying too." Clara stared at the ground. "I don't want you to give up," he said softly. "Because I haven't." Silence hung in the air. Then Clara whispered, "I'm scared." Michael turned. It was the first time she'd voiced that fear. Lee leaned in closer. "I'm scared too, but scared doesn't mean stop. It means you're close to something big." Clara wiped her face. "Okay, let's try again." And they did. Lee guided her through the motions gently, with less talking. Just presence, just patience. Michael joined in, helping her shift weight, encouraging every small twitch. After 30 minutes, Clara moved her right foot. Not just a toe, her entire foot. It slid forward, slow and stiff, but it moved. Michael knelt beside her, blinking as if he could hardly believe his eyes. "You did it." She smiled broadly. "I did it." He swallowed hard. "You really did it." Lee nodded, a sense of pride swelling within him. "Yeah, you did." Later that night, Michael stood outside his house, contemplating the moon. He had stopped questioning who Lee really was. It didn't matter anymore. Inside, Clara was animatedly retelling the moment to her aunt on speakerphone. For the first time in months, their home didn't feel like a hospital room. It felt like a home again, but something had begun to shift within Michael. Not just Clara's legs, but the weight in his own heart. The guilt, the pride, the wall he'd built between himself and the world. It was starting to crack. On Monday afternoon, Michael sat in his office, staring at a contract untouched. His phone buzzed with calls and emails, but nothing felt urgent anymore. What lingered in his mind was that moment in the park. Clara's foot sliding forward like it belonged to her again. He'd witnessed it with his own eyes, and the magic behind it was a 9-year-old with taped-up boots and a name he hadn't known before. He opened a new browser tab and typed, "Leo Thompson Maplewood." Nothing substantial appeared except a few scattered mentions. He clicked through community newsletters and school databases. Brief mentions of Leo and his mother, Patricia Thompson, who had worked at a local clinic. No address, no recent info. He shut his laptop and leaned back. This kid was a phantom, except he wasn't. By Saturday, they returned to Maplewood Park, but the atmosphere felt different. Michael brought an extra map and a folding chair. He handed Lee a sandwich when they arrived. No words exchanged, just a simple gesture. Lee thanked him quietly and tucked it away for later. "Ready, Clara?" Michael asked. She gave a big thumbs up. "Let's do it." They fell into their routine heat packs, stretches, toe flexes. Today, Michael joined in fully and sat cross-legged on the grass, mimicking each motion Lee explained. "Even messed it up once. You're bending the wrong way." Lee teased with a grin. Michael smirked. "I haven't stretched since college." They all chuckled, Clara's laughter ringing the brightest. About 20 minutes in, Lee leaned forward. "All right, Clara, let's try something different." He unfolded a belt from his bag and placed it under her knees. demonstrating how Michael could hold each end. She's gonna try to lift both knees now, just a little. We help balance her. She controls the movement. Michael blinked. You sure about this? Lee nodded. She's ready. They gave her a few seconds. Her brow furrowed, eyes narrowed, she grunted softly. And then her knees lifted slightly. Barely an inch, but they lifted. Michael looked at her, stunned. You did that. Clara smiled brightly. I did it. He felt a surge of emotion. You really did it. Lee nodded slowly, eyes gleaming with pride. See? The body remembers. You just have to be patient enough to let it talk. Michael gazed at Lee. You're something else, kid. Lee didn't respond. He merely continued guiding Clara through the next stretch. After their session, as they packed up, Michael crouched beside Lee. Where do you go after this? Lee shrugged. Around. Michael lowered his voice. Do you have a place to sleep? Lee hesitated before answering. Sometimes. Michael exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. You ever think about coming to stay with us for a while? Lee's eyes widened. Are you serious? I've got a guest room. You wouldn't be in the way. Lee looked down at his hands. You sure your neighbors wouldn't mind a kid like me? Michael chuckled lightly. After what you've done for my daughter, they'd better not say a word. Lee took a moment before responding, but Michael could see the wheels turning in his mind. The following day, Lee stood outside Michael's home, backpack slung over one shoulder, a rolled-up blanket tucked under his arm. Michael opened the door in sweatpants, a coffee mug in hand. Right on time, he said. Clara raced to the front hallway. Lee. He smiled. Hey, superstar. Michael stepped aside. Welcome home. The days that followed were quiet yet profound. Lee had his own room, a soft bed, clean sheets, and a small desk. He didn't say much, but he never missed a morning stretch with Clara. She was moving both feet now. Not walking yet, but the wheels were turning. Her brain was reconnecting with her legs. One night, as Michael cleaned the dishes, he paused and leaned on the counter. Lee, he said over his shoulder. Ever think about going back to school? Lee, sketching at the kitchen table, glanced up. Sometimes. Michael nodded. You're smart. You could go far. Lee tilted his head. I want to help people walk again, like my mom did. Michael turned to face him. Then let's figure out how to get you there. Lee smiled. Okay. They didn't say much more that night. They didn't need to. But for the first time in years, the Hastings household was filled with small sounds that signified life. Footsteps, laughter, scribbles, and healing. It began with a nurse from the Maplewood Children's Hospital. She was walking her dog through Maplewood Park one Sunday morning when she spotted a familiar face. Clara. She hadn't seen Clara outside her wheelchair in months, let alone smiling, lifting her knees and moving her toes. The nurse didn't interrupt. She simply observed from a distance. When she returned home, she shared her observations with her sister, who worked in patient services. A few days later, a physical therapist at the hospital asked Michael, Hey, someone mentioned Clara's improving. Is that true? Michael nodded. Yeah, thanks to someone we didn't expect. Word spread quickly. The next time they arrived at Maplewood Park, 2 other families awaited them on the bench near the oak tree. One had a boy who used a walker. The other had a girl recovering from a stroke. Both parents had heard about the kid who helped Clara move her legs again. Lee looked at Michael, who met his gaze. You don't have to, Michael said quietly. Lee looked around at the families, at the children moving with their parents' encouragement. He nodded. I want to. Lee relinquished his time with Clara that day to work with the 2 new kids. He demonstrated how to perform towel stretches, how to warm the rice packs, how to encourage without pushing too hard, and he communicated with the kids. Not at them. You're not broken, he told one child. You're just learning a different way to be strong. Clara watched from her wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't complain once. Later that afternoon, as they drove home, Clara said, I like watching him help people. Michael glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Yeah, it makes me feel like we're part of something good. He smiled. By the following Sunday, The park was bustling with families eager to see Lee. There were 10 new families present, some familiar faces from the hospital, others drawn in by word of mouth. Lee was now a beacon of hope in the community. As they settled in, Michael felt a sense of pride swell within him. The laughter of children filled the air, and the park had transformed into a space of healing and connection. Lee set up the same routine. Towels laid on the grass, warm rice packs prepared. But today felt different. Clara was ready. She had spent the week practicing and was eager to show Lee what she could do. "Ready, Clara?" Lee asked, kneeling beside her. Clara nodded, determination shining in her eyes. With Michael's assistance, she was lifted gently from her wheelchair, and for the first time, she stood on her own 2 feet. The crowd fell silent, witnessing the miracle of perseverance. Clara took a shaky step forward, then another, and then, without warning, she took a 3rd step, all on her own before falling into Michael's waiting arms. He caught her, laughing and crying, disbelief washing over him. "You did it," he exclaimed. Cheers erupted from the gathered families, and Clara grinned from ear to ear. "I'm walking," she shouted, and the park buzzed with joy. Lee stood back, his heart swelling with pride. He had given Clara more than just movement. He had given her hope. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, the families lingered in the park, sharing stories, laughter, and hugs. Michael approached Lee, who was sitting on a bench, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've changed everything," he said. Lee looked up, eyes bright. "I just wanted to help." As the day faded into twilight, Michael realized that the community Lee had created was about so much more than just healing bodies. It was about healing hearts, forging connections, and creating a space where everyone mattered. In the weeks to come, more families joined, and the park transformed into a sanctuary of hope. The children laughed, played, and practiced their movements together, strengthening not only their bodies but also their spirits. Months passed, and as winter gave way to spring, Maplewood Park thrived with life. Lee had become a fixture in the community, a symbol of resilience and unwavering spirit. Michael watched as Clara took her first steps without assistance, her laughter ringing out like music. One afternoon, as they sat beneath the oak tree, Lee turned to Michael. "I want to help more people, but I need to learn more," he said earnestly. Michael smiled, knowing what he needed to do. "Let's make that happen," he replied. "You're going to change lives, Lee." And as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, a shared understanding passed between them. Sometimes it was the most unlikely heroes, a boy with taped-up boots and a heart full of hope, who held the power to heal not only others but also themselves. If the story has inspired you, share it. If you know a kid like Lee or a girl like Clara, remind them that they matter. They are needed. And sometimes, the greatest gifts come from those who have experienced the most pain, reminding us all that love, hope, and healing can flourish in the unlikeliest of places.